Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, football fans alike, we are back here at Steve Money's Take. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been bone dry when it comes to any content this offseason. It is my time to finally pay you guys back with some highly anticipated and some well-deserving NFL draft content. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we are 2 weeks away from the NFL draft, and what better way to kickstart this thing than letting you guys have a top 10 quarterback rankings for the 2025 NFL draft. So if you guys remember last year, we did something very similar where we listed 10 quarterbacks who we thought were the most quality, the most capable, and the most intriguing prospects, commodities for the upcoming NFL draft. It turned out pretty well. I think we were right about a lot of guys, and I think we maybe have proven some people wrong even from last year of how we felt about some guys. So maybe we could do a little bit of the same thing this year as well. And in case you want to go back to last year's video, go ahead. You'll be able to find it in my gallery. It'll be in there somewhere. So anyways, without any further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in to this listing. And like I said, this is not the most stacked from top to bottom quarterbacks that we've seen. Like, take it for instance last year with 5 quarterbacks in the first round. Many of those guys who are, potential superstars in the making. You take guys like Jaden Daniels, who had the most successful rookie season that I believe we've ever seen out of quarterback. Take a guy like Bo Nix, who turned into a franchise quarterback. I think Drake May, Michael Penix Jr., these are guys who are on the uprise, who could be potential elite tier quarterbacks at the next level. J.J. McCarthy is going to get his stab at it in Minnesota. And, of course, Caleb Williams, having a very dreadful season last year. Only time could tell how much that can improve. But I don't think this quarterback class is as stacked as it was last year. We even thought there was some sleepers last year who could have turned out to be really successful quarterbacks, or maybe their time is waiting. This year, maybe not quite the same. And of course, with every draft, there's always going to be that one guy who everybody sort of evaluates and says, well, maybe he'll make it, maybe he won't. We know that there's hype and there's potential around him to be a successful playmaker. And only time will tell about that. But there's always going to be that boom or bust guy in every single draft process, and everybody knows that. We're no stranger to that. I think at my number 10 spot is the ultimate boom or bust commodity in this year's draft, and ladies and gentlemen, that's none other than Quinn Ewers from Texas. Now, you take a guy like Quinn Ewers, and he was one of the most difficult watches for me of any of these quarterbacks. Now, I will say his, short intermediate passing game is probably about as effective as any quarterback in this year's draft class. He's right up there with some of the better ones. I think he can push the ball down the field, relatively good as well. But when you watch this guy from this past season, and of course you talk about the durability concerns, you talk about the consistency problems that were very much left to be desired for a guy like Quinn Ewers, especially after he was coming off of an injury. A lot of the times from Texas, this is a guy that has not played a full season in back-to-back years. This is a guy that really, when you were watching him play last year, a lot of the times it felt like, they knew that Arch Manning was in the wing, the highly touted kid, obviously with the bloodlines and everything. That could spark some interest from Texas for having him as being their quarterback. It just seemed like this past season with Quinn Ewers that they were really just sort of just riding him out to the end. They were just sort of just dragging him out there as their quarterback, as if it was just, Texas and Steve Sarkisian's way of sort of granting him some, respect for the jobs that he's done, or whatever it was. But, you watched him play down the stretch of the season. He just did not look great. He did not push the ball down the field too effectively. He just really sort of turned into a field general quarterback. Just did his best not to turn the ball over. They really didn't just cut him loose with anything too many of the times. They just sort of just rided this guy out till the very end. And, I'm guaranteed if he was to come back to Texas next season, I'm sure Arch Manning would probably win the job over Quinn Ewers, honestly. And then also to talk about a guy like Quinn Ewers, there's nothing really too unique about his game. He doesn't really extend plays all too well. He's not really that good under pressure either, which I think was one thing that we saw down the stretch of the season for a guy like him is he's not a good quarterback when the pocket breaks down. And, that is definitely going to be an alarming set of circumstances if he goes to the wrong team in the NFL. So ultimately, a guy like Quinn Ewers, to me, as far as I'm concerned, there's plenty of boom or bust potential. Now, maybe he gets into the right place that's able to help groom him, able to find out that, hey, this guy was a highly touted kid at one time. Can we finally get some potential? Can we get this guy eased in? Or just outright, because of all the things that we said about him, it all just flops and the Quinn Ewers phenomenon just expires as soon as he gets to the NFL. You watched him throw at the scouting combine. He didn't look too sharp or effective at all at that either. So Quinn Ewers, to me, he's the ultimate boomer bust, and I think he's totally deserving of my number 10 ranking. All right, so moving on to number 9. Now, number 9 quarterback for me really was sort of a toss-up to me because, in my opinion, there's several quarterbacks who could have slotted here at number 9. It really genuinely came down between a coin toss for me, and a lot of thinking was involved into it, but it's none other than Curtis Rourke from Indiana, the Hoosiers quarterback, slotting here at my number 9 spot. And like I said, I think there's a lot of dudes who could have fallen under this category. I think Will Howard, obviously the national champion at Ohio State, could have been in this conversation. I think you can also turn to several other guys who also could have slanted here into this conversation. But a guy like Curtis Rourke, man, to me, he totally epitomizes what these other guys really sort of epitomize is a field general quarterback. Came from Ohio, where he was, he was a little bit up and down throughout his college career, never really had any major success, at Ohio until he comes to Indiana, man. And, one thing leads to another, man. He comes to Indiana, and all of a sudden, he leads the nation by storm. He elevates this Indiana football team into a, very successful football team that, eventually made the college football playoffs. And quite a Cinderella story that, the Indiana Hoosiers had this past season at quarterback. And he was the guy under center. He was the guy that really elevated this team. He's the guy that, you really can't necessarily say he was the main sole reason why they got there, but he was a big part of what the spark to the fire was for Indiana this past season. And like I said, he really is he's a field general quarterback. He's got really good short intermediate passing ability. Not too much with the downfield velocity. I do think that's when he's sort of selective. But I think, he's pretty decent under pressure, which I think is a little bit of a unique attribute to him. Now, you could also turn on the tape for a couple of games like the Ohio State game. You could look to games like, in the playoffs against Notre Dame, where he was just sort of, a statue and sort of looked like that he was a frozen, he looked like he was like a frozen caveman for a lot of that game and really just didn't do a whole lot of anything. He was pretty ineffective throughout most of those games, which were, big-time games where you really needed him to respond. Then you look at some games like the game against Michigan, a couple of other games, obviously against more inferior competition where you definitely saw that, Curtis Rourke going to have some big-time passing statistical games. Of course, like I said, he's a field general quarterback. He's going to be probably nothing more but a backup quarterback in the NFL. But I definitely think of all the guys in the crop, I do think he was more intriguing than a guy like Will Howard from Ohio State because of, a few metrics that, got into the way. So I think Curtis Rourke, totally deserving of this number 9 spot as this is a true bona fide field general backup quarterback role in the NFL. Moving on to our number 8 quarterback. And my number 8 quarterback, in my opinion, is a name that's going to be it's going to be a name that a lot of people have sort of in this process been exposed and have become very familiar with. I think he's the most controversial quarterback in the entire draft. I think a lot of people have split opinions on him. I think either people really are, promoting his name out there or really saying a lot of high praise for him, and that's none other than Tyler Shough from Louisville, my number 8 quarterback. I've seen some recent mock drafts that actually have this kid going relatively early in the second round. I've even heard some experts say this guy might be knocking on the door to be a late first-round quarterback, which I think is completely asinine. I think it's really, in my opinion, asinine that he's even going as early as the second round. I more or less have a 5th-round grade on this guy. And for the rest of the guys, I'd probably say more like a 6th or 7th-round grade. And I don't think Tyler Shough is as great as advertised. And you listen to guys like Louis Riddick in the sports media, and nothing but love for Louis Riddick, obviously. He's a great guy. But guys like Field Yates and Louis Riddick and so many of these dudes from ESPN, they're such huge fans of this guy, Tyler Shough. And I watched the guy play, and yes, he's a guy that I really want to like. And there's so many things to him that I want to say, yeah, that's that NFL throw I saw him make, against Miami, or that's that big time play where he was under pressure and got popped and delivered a beautiful throw against Notre Dame. I want to be able to tell myself and convince myself that this guy could have a real conceivable shot at being a capable starting quarterback, possibly in the NFL. But it's sort of a statement I sort of have told myself throughout this process, and allow me to share it with you guys listening to this video. And I think it's probably one of the most accurate statements anybody could ever make about Tyler Shough. And that's, regarding his age, he is 25 years old. I think he's soon to turn 26 by the start of the season. So if you really want to know just the complete lowdown assessment of a guy like Tyler Shough, think to yourself, do I want to be drafting a 26-year-old quarterback who might only play 3 or 4 years in the NFL? Quarterbacks in the NFL, fresh out of college, do not have long leashes, long, careers. A lot of the times you take a guy like Trey Lance, who's all of a sudden now he's fighting to get on the NFL roster. He struggled to get signed in free agency. He was 3rd overall pick in the draft. You talk about a guy like Zach Wilson, who was immensely impressive at his pro day, and so many people were drooling over him. He went as high as number 2. He is a bona fide backup quarterback in the NFL now. And you take a dude like this with Tyler Shough, and one thing that both of those 2 quarterbacks that I had already mentioned had going for them was that they were younger commodities. They were guys who people thought possibly could be a guy that you could build a franchise around. Now, of course, both of those teams went to places that it just didn't work out. A guy like Tyler Shough is about to be 26 years old. Though you watch him play this past season at Louisville, he was very effective at times. He was pretty decent under pressure, but you also can't cease to forget that this guy's been playing in college football for 3 other teams. He played at Oregon, where it didn't work out. I'm not necessarily sure why he transferred out of Oregon, which was the big-time program that he was playing for, but I would have to think durability problems may have had something to do with it, considering he was getting injured. You take Texas Tech, where he goes to Texas Tech, and he shows some flashes and capability. And ironically, I remember he played Oregon, his former team, and had one of his better performances against them. But, you think everything's going great, and then the guy gets injured. Reminds me a lot of quarterbacks that have played in the NFL who – you think you see all the flash, you see all the fireworks, and then eventually they're going to get injured. And then, teams are going to be having to spend money on a guy who's not going to play full seasons in the NFL. I don't know what else you got to say. College football nowadays is so much different than it used to be. Guys can play so many years in the sport, and I think we are given so much of a good sample size of what these guys are going to become that, we can say to ourselves, we have a pretty good idea of what they're going to be like in the NFL. I know a lot of people have compared his experience to the experience that guys like Jaden Daniels had, that Michael Penix Jr. had, but all in all, those dudes played through most of those seasons. I know Penix had an injury at Indiana, but came back-to-back seasons at Washington and was one of the most prolific passers in the nation. We never saw that from Tyler Shough. But who knows? I think he's definitely notable. I think he made some really outstanding throws at the combine during those drills. He was really good with the short accuracy throws and the deep throws. So, we're holding on by a thread that he might be able to be a good, solid backup quarterback in the NFL. I do think that might be his ceiling. Other than that, I don't see the potential with Tyler Shough. And quite frankly, I think he's a very avoidable prospect for anybody that's thinking about a quarterback early in the draft process. So he's going to notch here at our number 8 spot just because there's some intrigue to his name. Coming in at our number 7 spot, we got one of my personal favorite quarterbacks to watch out of this entire draft, and that is Brady Cook from Missouri. Man, oh man, I really love this kid, Brady Cook. He is, in my opinion, one of the most fighting quarterbacks that when you watch his tape, you're just like, man, this is a kid that's got passion. He's got a passion to win. He's got a passion to make a first down every single time he's playing, whether it's throwing the football, whether it's him utilizing his underrated mobility as an aspect, which he showed everybody at the combine, being one of the few quarterbacks who ran the 40-yard dash. I love Brady Cook. Brady Cook he's a true hardcore. He's a grit football player. I think one of the more unique things about Brady Cook and why he is my number 7 quarterback is because I think he pushes the ball down the field a lot better than a lot of people give him praise for, man. He had the big-time weapons like Luther Burden III. He had Theo Weiss. He had a really good arsenal of pass catchers at Missouri, and he was delivering it to him. Brady Cook was the guy that was distributing it to him, and he was getting those guys involved. As I mentioned, he has really underrated mobility as well, and he's a guy that fights hard for first downs. I love that kind of character in a guy, man. It kind of reminds me a little bit about how Baker Mayfield plays the position in the NFL. But, of course, there are some downsides to a guy like Brady Cook because you compare the 23 tape to the 24 tape, and it's quite a world of differences comparing and contrasting between the two seasons where he was, in my opinion, he was one of the most underrated quarterbacks in the SEC Conference. If you remember our early top 10 quarterback rankings that we came out with back in August, you remember me talking a lot about Brady Cook, how I thought he was poised for a huge season, how he was poised to surprise a lot of people and maybe perhaps be that quarterback who comes out of nowhere and rises up draft boards. But instead, you were sort of left with quite a disappointing season, especially from a stat line perspective. And even on the field, there was just Brady Cook he was a little bit flat. You take that game they had against Texas A&M where most of the game they're getting dominated, they're just getting bullied by Texas A&M. He comes together late in the game, makes some of the most impressive throws he had of the season. You take the game against South Carolina where it's sort of the same set of circumstances, a little bit more closer within the scoreboard, but he makes that big throw to Luther Burden late in the ball game, which eventually was one of the most critical plays of their season. Brady Cook I still think he's got that, that dog mentality in him. I think he's going to be a really good backup quarterback in the NFL, as we mentioned, for the vast majority of all these other guys. I think he's vastly underrated. I love the way the kid plays the game. And look, man, I think he's a really great player. I think he's a great competitor. And I think that's one of the things I really like out of a quarterback. And yeah, I think really the thing that really bought him a lot of stock, quite simply, was his combine performance. Running the 40-yard dash, being one of the few quarterbacks to do it. Even in the throwing drills, I thought Brady Cook, very underrated, and not a lot of people were buzzing about him, but I was very impressed. Give me Brady Cook as my number 7 quarterback, man. All right, we are on a roll, ladies and gentlemen. Number 6 quarterback in my top 10 rankings, none other than Kyle McCord from Syracuse. Now, here's the thing about Kyle McCord is that now he was a guy that we came in this season, formerly from Ohio State. He kind of had a little rough and tough right over there in Columbus. Obviously, the Buckeyes had really good success with him. Obviously, disappointing loss to Michigan, which is becoming too much of a common theme for the Ohio State Buckeyes. But he had a really great game against Notre Dame, which was an all-time classic game for Ohio State. We remember watching, Marvin Harrison Jr. from last year's draft playing that game where he got locked down by Benjamin Morrison. But Kyle McCord was very effective in that ball game. I thought he was a little bit underrated at Ohio State. Obviously was very much a field general quarterback, not too much else besides that. And then he transfers. He leaves. He sort of got bumped out of the program. The program pretty much wanted him to take a hike. And he comes to Syracuse, and all of a sudden, you turn on some random Saturday, and Kyle McCord is lighting up the scoreboard with big-time passing statistics. 400, 300 yards were almost a given for a guy like Kyle McCord at Syracuse. Had amazing games. One game that comes to mind was the Miami game, where he was just impeccable performing in that ball game against the Canes, and which was one of the biggest upsets of the season this past year. You take his bowl game against Washington State, where I think he threw for like 471 passing yards. I mean, he was purely prolific. Love a lot about Kyle McCord. I still think and I still evaluate him as a field general quarterback. I don't think that much has changed out of him. He is one of the best and the most sharpest short intermediate passing quarterbacks in this entire draft. Pretty much can just drill darts in the short intermediate passing game. There's a lot of things I like about Kyle McCord. I think he also, he's also pretty solid under pressure, much like a lot of these other field general quarterbacks that we had made mention of. But like I said, he's bona fidely a backup quarterback. He's bona fidely a field general quarterback. I don't know what it is. I feel like there's just, I don't know, maybe it's a lack of arm talent or arm strength, that prevented him from being a little bit more better as a true prolific passer. But nevertheless, I think he's the kind of guy that could be a very, serviceable backup quarterback in the NFL. I think he's a guy that can deliver the football in places where it needs to be placed. He was very outstanding, excelled in every single game this past year at Syracuse, except some random Thursday night game, I believe when they played Pitt, and he was a little bit bad in that game. And I say a little bit, he was pretty damn bad. I believe he threw like 3 or 4 interceptions in that game where he was just really off his marker. So other than that, you take so many games, for instance, where he's pushing the ball down the field. He's so poised in the short intermediate passing game. Yes, sir. Give me Kyle McCord. He's my number 6 quarterback right here in this draft process. All right. Entering the realm of the top 5. And as we get into the top 5, and contrary to last year, where when we were getting into the top 5, we were talking about dudes who were potential franchise quarterbacks. Now, I think this is when last year and this year sort of differ, because I still think very much we're still talking about maybe for the next 3 spots up until maybe the top 2, we're talking about dudes who are probably going to be backup quarterbacks, at least for their first year in the NFL and, maybe for a few years in the NFL. It all depends on how everything plays out. But I really love this number 5 quarterback. I think he's a guy that really, I think he's the most slept-on quarterback in the entire draft process. And that is none other than Dillon Gabriel, quarterback from Oregon. Now, this is the guy that you want to talk about experience. And everyone talks about that with Tyler Shough. It's all great and dandy and everything. But a guy that genuinely excelled from experience, a guy that dominated, had good durability, really great consistency, was Dillon Gabriel. UCF Knights starting quarterback for like 2 or 3 years, I believe. He was very good. He was very effective. He thrived in that Josh Heupel offense for several seasons there. Then he transfers to Oklahoma. I remember he goes to Oklahoma. Not a lot of people are buzzing about his name. He's been underrated all of his, quarterback career. He goes to Oklahoma, and What does he do? Well, he just sort of, leads them to an undefeated start and beats Texas in the Red River rivalry game in one of the most clutch fashions you can possibly strum together. A methodical drive which led Oklahoma down the field to beat Texas. Same Texas team that went pretty deep into the college football playoffs, might we be reminded. Dillon Gabriel was pretty damn good at Oklahoma. I think some people forget about that. He goes to Oregon this past season where he took his game to the next height. I think he added some layers into dimensions to his game this past year at Oregon. I think that Oregon offense was just absolutely perfect for Dillon Gabriel. We've been raving about this guy even before he took snaps at Oregon. If you remember our early top 10 quarterback rankings back in August, you're talking about a dude whom, in my opinion, he's one of the best short intermediate passing quarterbacks as well. But the thing I like the most about Dillon Gabriel is that he's one of the best quarterbacks at extending plays. And he's so fun at extending plays, man. It's like he's one of those kind of guys that he's either going to be on the run or he's going to throw the football with some velocity down the field. Or he's going to fool an entire defense by taking off and utilizing his underrated mobility aspect as well. I really like that out of Dillon Gabriel. If you remember the game he had against Oregon State, he had a very long run for a touchdown in that game. This is a guy that's very sharp, very effective. He's played in big-time college football games. Take, for instance, Ohio State game this past year where I thought he was like one of their key reasons of their success in that ball game. He was so damn good this past season. Oregon obviously was the number one team all the way up until the college football playoffs. I think that was no mistake, and I think they couldn't have done it without Dillon Gabriel, man. He is indeed one of the most underrated, one of the most unique quarterbacks in this year's draft. And I think he's going to have, obviously I think he's gonna share time being a backup quarterback in the NFL, but I think by the time he gets to the NFL, he's going to open a lot of people's eyes, and he's going to be like, hey, we might need to get this guy some more significant playing time because the kid can play. I know a lot of people talk about his size, but, man, he's not that small. He's literally 6 foot on the spot. I think he's not as small as guys like we've seen with Kyler Murray and Russell Wilson. People want to talk about him being that small, and, I've never thought that size really mattered too much in the NFL, seeing that those guys have gone on to have really good careers. So I think it's sort of a bullshit narrative by this given point in time. So give me Dillon Gabriel. And in my opinion, he's by far one of the best quarterbacks in the entire draft. Give me Dillon Gabriel at number 5. All right, moving on. Number 4 quarterback in the draft. And if Tyler Shough is the most controversial quarterback in the entire draft, I would beg to differ that if there's any guy that maybe threatens him for being the most controversial or is teetering on the brink of being the second most controversial, I would say is my number 4 quarterback, Jackson Dart from Ole Miss. Now, let me just make it abundantly clear. I like Jackson Dart. I've been a big fan of I've seen Jackson Dart play actually 2 times. Saw him play against LSU, and I saw him play in the Senior Bowl, where I thought he was the best quarterback down in Mobile for the Senior Bowl when I saw them up close and personal. Jackson Dart is a very, very interesting quarterback because, you look at his skill set. He's one of the most effective, efficient, and accurate quarterbacks in this year's draft. He's played in so many fun games throughout his career at Ole Miss. Talk about that game I just mentioned against LSU back in 23. You talk about the bowl game against Penn State that he played in. That was a fun game. And then you talk about so many shootout efforts that Jackson Dart was a part of. What about this game against LSU this past season that they played in? What about the game against Georgia? Hard-fought win in the rain. And then you can even talk about that wild one that they had against Arkansas this past season where I believe he threw for 500 passing yards in that game. Jackson Dart is a guy that he's one of the most poised and accurate quarterbacks in the entire draft. And I think he was one of the things that made college football so fun with watching Ole Miss with Jackson Dart. He's a really fun player. You turn him on tape and you're like, hey, this is This is a guy that might get some first-round buzz. He's also really tremendous under pressure. I mean, this guy can take a pop, okay? This guy can take a heat-seeking missile linebacker coming in his face. He can have pass rushers breathe down his neck and still throw a pretty pass down the field. Jackson Dart is just, man, he's a hard, tough quarterback. I think he's got underrated mobility as well. Like I said, he was the best quarterback in Mobile for the Senior Bowl. In that game, I thought he was the most effective quarterback. Even in some practices, he was the most confident quarterback out there in Mobile. He was pretty effective at the Combine as well, though I don't think he was the most effective at the Combine, but I do think he definitely was a showcase. But there is some setbacks to Jackson Dart. And if anybody knows, before, there's been plenty of draft classes that I haven't covered here on YouTube personally, but I myself have been covering the draft for really, honestly, for almost about 6 or 7 years. Obviously, last year was first year I covered it on YouTube. This will be my second year with YouTube coverage. But we do remember the last time Ole Miss had a quarterback come out in that system, and that was Matt Corral a few years ago. Very similar, the same number, the same offense, very similar skill set, right? We remember Matt Corral was one of the biggest splats on the wall of a bus we've ever seen. Now, granted, I understand he got drafted to a very dysfunctional Carolina Panthers organization, and it really splat all over the place for him. It didn't go too well, but that's not the point. The point ultimately is this Lane Kiffin offense is a very particular kind of offense that I just don't think translates well for quarterbacks who are seeking to become successful in the NFL and having to learn different offenses. I mean, it's very dependent on the RPO game. It's very dependent on several things that I just don't think cope well for quarterbacks in terms of being successful in the NFL. So Jackson Dart, I mean, he's got plenty of potential. I think, honestly, setbacks aside, he's the third best quarterback in this entire draft because you look at the way he plays. He's one of the most accurate quarterbacks in the draft. He pushes the ball down the field about as good as any quarterback in this year's draft. And, I've even heard so many people say he's the best deep ball thrower in the draft. And, I can't really look at you and say that you're bullshitting me because you watch him play, you're like, yeah, Jackson Dart's pretty damn good at that also. So I like Jackson Dart. You take everything aside from him, all the setbacks aside, he's the third best quarterback in the draft. I think you'd have to lay down a second-round grade on him regardless of how you look at him, simply because of the fact that there are some selective things to him. But even when you take those things away, I still see second-round grade just because I only view 2 quarterbacks in this year's draft as true, definitive first-round grade quarterbacks, which we'll get to those guys shortly after we, discuss our number 3 quarterback. But Jackson Dart, to me, too many setbacks and too many red flags sort of clout him. I think he's a guy that sort of could prove me wrong, and I think he can prove a lot of people wrong. So only time will tell. But with those setbacks, with everything in the way, there was one other guy that I think is better, who does have a set of setbacks himself, but I don't think it's a whole schematical thing. I think sometimes it's some other things, and that is none other than Jalen Milroe from the University of Alabama. And I think he also has a second-round grade likewise as well. Now, if you want to talk about a guy that probably has one of the best rocket cannon arms of any quarterback in this year's draft, it would be none other than Jalen Milroe. Jalen Milroe has an absolute piss missile that he has, man. And I hear a lot of people use that as something to describe a guy with a cannon arm, but yes, indeed, man, he has an absolute rocket launcher. He has an absolute cannon for an arm at quarterback. He is a guy that can launch the ball down the field. He can put it right in receiver's way. You look at his 23 tape. That guy was launching balls down the field so many times, so effectively, so efficiently. And you're just like, man, There was a reason why Jalen Milroe was receiving Heisman hype back in 2023, because you watch him play, man, he is sailing that football down the field, and he is hitting it in his receiver's hands. He also has this incredible underrated, mobility aspect as well, which I think also makes him such a unique prospect. But the honest to God truth about Milroe is that there are setbacks to him as well. People talk a lot about, he's not the most pure accurate quarterback because he doesn't do nothing in a short intermediate game, which very, wildly true. That is a fact. For some reason, he does struggle in that department, which in my opinion, I think it has nothing to do with his skill set or anything. I think it more or less has more to do with the fact that he doesn't do too well under pressure. I think that's something that's more of his issue more than his just true accuracy. I mean, I never was a question of accuracy for a guy like Jalen Milroe. I think it's more of how does he handle pressure. You saw him under pressure in the Senior Bowl. Femi Oladejo was able to get a piece of him in that ball game and, rattle him up in that game. But it's never a matter of pressure for Jalen. I mean, it is a matter of pressure for Jalen Milroe. It's never a matter of his true accuracy mechanics. I think he has one of the best deep balls of any quarterback in a class. We mentioned Jackson Dart with his as well. I think Milroe is about as effective, and I think he's such an effective running threat at quarterback. I mean, it's unbelievable when he takes off and runs. He looks like a power back trotting down the field, trotting down the sideline. He's very effective at what he's able to do with his wheels and his mobility. Word has it that he ran in the 4.3s at Alabama's Pro Day, which, that being said, he's automatically going to be one of the fastest quarterbacks in the league. And I honestly, I see a lot of Anthony Richardson to his game. I think he's a higher potential Anthony Richardson. I think Milroe can be more successful than an Anthony Richardson. I think he has better leadership skills than Anthony Richardson. I think he has more experience in college than Anthony Richardson, and better coaching, by the way. I mean, you play for Nick Saban, you play for Kalen DeBoer, you're playing with the best, okay? So you got the better coaching aspect out of the way as well for a guy like Jalen Milroe. I think he's going to be a better project quarterback than what we thought of Anthony Richardson. And honestly, this might be one of my biggest hot takes. And I know it's going to be very controversial for anyone listening, but I think if his ceiling hits, I think Jalen Milroe could honestly be a poor man's version of Lamar Jackson. I absolutely definitively believe that to be true. I didn't say Lamar Jackson. I didn't say we're hitting it, nail on the head. He's going to be the next Lamar Jackson. I say he could be a poor man's version of Lamar Jackson. So that's the way I perceive to look at it. And that's all if he gets to the right organization. I think there's certain teams that Jalen Milroe could have success with over others. And then, of course, there's always that situation where, you take a couple of these other guys that we've seen in years past and they just don't translate. It's because of what situation that they land in. And that's just what it's all predicated upon. I got a second-round grade on Milroe. I think him and Jackson Dart are relatively close. But I think they're both second-round graded quarterbacks, not quite in the range of a first-round guy. If you want to talk about first-round quarterbacks, and as everyone's here to listen, they want to know who the faces of the NFL are soon to be. And I'm here to tell you who I think some of these guys are going to be. And I think it's two guys. My number 2 quarterback, Shedeur Sanders from Colorado, who previously was my number 1 quarterback in our last top 10 quarterback rankings for this quarterback crop of guys. Let me tell you something about Shedeur Sanders. And I just sort of want to take some time to send a message to any naysayers of Shedeur Sanders, the people who are doubting Shedeur Sanders. I think you guys are doing a tremendous job because the more you doubt him, the more he's going to prove you wrong. Shedeur Sanders is a absolute franchise quarterback. He's one of the most poised and accurate quarterbacks in this year's draft class. And, we just talked so much uniquely about Jackson Dart and Jalen Milroe's ability to push the ball down the field. But, I've heard a lot of criticism towards his downfield passing is complete asinine. This man is debatably the most poised and accurate quarterback pushing the ball down the field. He is as prolific as other guys we had mentioned. And the most unique thing I love about Shedeur Sanders is you watch this guy's tape. You watch how he responds under pressure. When the pocket breaks down, when pass rushers are coming in his face. I know he's taken a lot of sacks. He doesn't play at colleges like Ole Miss. He doesn't play at the Alabamas of the world. He doesn't play at any of the high marquee schools. But you got to realize, man, that was sort of a Colorado program that was sort of built from scratch, and Shedeur Sanders just had to play with what he could under center. But let me tell you, man, you see so many plays. This guy is delivering under pressure. So many times I saw this guy just look so poised under pressure. I'm like, damn, that is a guy who is going to take the NFL by storm. He's going to show his bloodlines are going to reflect exactly who he is. And this dude, I'm telling you, complete making of a franchise quarterback. Any guys that can extend plays about as effectively as Shedeur Sanders and have the accuracy to push the ball down the field have the making of a franchise quarterback. And, of course, everybody wants to come harshly at Shedeur Sanders. Everybody wants to say that there's setbacks to him, that he doesn't have enough mobility, that he's too much of a pocket-present quarterback. But when did that ever fail anybody in the NFL? When did that ever fail Tom Brady? When did that fail Peyton Manning? When does that fail dudes like Dan Marino and Joe Montana? You talk about the all-time greats. That never failed any of these guys, because I can tell you right here and now that Shedeur Sanders, I got him as a top 5 grade, as you see above. He's a top 5 grade at quarterback. I absolutely love Shedeur Sanders, and I think he's about to become one of the league's biggest spectacles. Him and Travis Hunter, whoever drafts these guys. And another thing I'd like to allude about Shedeur Sanders is, of course, everyone wants to talk about his tape. He didn't play quality competition, and that's the same thing about these two top quarterbacks, is that in their conferences, they didn't see the best players or the best defenses or the best complete teams, but they could only play who they're scheduled. I thought Shedeur Sanders, a lot of the times, was completely dominant against the competition he played against. I realized maybe not the most effective game he had against BYU. There was a few throws in that game. We're talking about the bowl game they had against BYU, where I think that he could have been a little bit better, obviously, but I still think there was little throws smudged in there. Obviously he knew that he was about to take off and come to the NFL. And but other than that, you watch a lot of his tape in a lot of other games. Shedeur Sanders is about as effective as it gets. And I mentioned it, bro. You cannot take this guy down. I mean, the pocket breaks down. He extends plays. He's rifling the ball down the field. You remember the play he had against Baylor where he threw a Hail Mary pass with almost no time? Is one of the most clutch throws of the college football season from last year. I mean, that, to me, is pretty indicative of how Shedeur Sanders plays. And he's been so accurate and very poised with many other plays that you could watch him play at Colorado this past season. Give me Shedeur Sanders, man. He is a great quarterback. But as much as I'm praising him and as much as I think this guy is going to be a franchise quarterback and take the NFL by storm, I just have to say Cam Ward is number 1. And I have no other choice, because Cam Ward, much like Shedeur Sanders, has sort of taken the nation by storm also. This guy, let me tell you, and if you remember our top 10 what we had back in August, we talked about Cam Ward. And even myself, I was like, well, I hope this doesn't fuck me over, because I was like, we had him at number 10. I really remember what he did at Washington. He was one of the most fun players at the University of Washington, and I was like, man, this guy almost is like a video game kind of player, this Cam Ward guy. And then, has a really fun ride at Washington State. I remember he had a big game against Oregon. He had a couple of other big games, against some really good competition. They played Washington that last game of the season, that team that went on to the national championship game. They played Oregon State. I mean, they played a bunch of really good teams out there in the former Pac-12 conference. But I don't think a lot of people knew who he was when he played at Washington State. He was very underrated. He comes to Miami. First game against Florida. he lights it up. He makes NFL throw after NFL throw after NFL throw. I can't stop hearing the commentators talk about Cam Ward making an NFL throw with his sidearm, his extending of the play. I mean, it was just too good. It was too good of a spectacle to watch. And it continued throughout the entire season. You watch this guy play a thriller against Virginia Tech. That was a weak game, I remember. That was a clutch win for Miami. Then you remember the Cal game where he came all the way back to beat Cal in a game where they were merely just cotton napping on the West Coast. They came all the way back and proved resilience in that ball game. This guy was so good for Miami, even in Miami's losses against Georgia Tech, even against Syracuse, which was a thrilling, stunning loss. We mentioned Kyle McCord being a big part of that game. But, Cam Ward is, and I know a lot of people giving him, a lot of crap about not playing the full game in that Iowa State game. But I thought just in one half, man, he was about as elite as it gets in that ball game. I mean, he was just absolutely dynamite. Comes into the season, he could have won the Heisman this past year. He was so good this past year. I know Travis Hunter was deserving, but Cam Ward was right up there. I do believe this guy is probably, in my opinion, if you look at the short intermediate game, I think he's the best accurate quarterback I think I've maybe ever seen of a quarterback in a very long time. He's so great at the short intermediate passing game, pushing the ball down the field. He may not be as good as some of the other guys, but he's really excellent at it as well. And I think a lot of people love his ability to extend plays and his ability under pressure. But now you're probably wondering, what definitively makes Cam Ward better than Shedeur Sanders? Because I really went on a whole discussion about how good Shedeur Sanders is. And, ultimately, I think the biggest thing for a guy like Cam Ward is the fact that he has unique mobility to his game that I think really defies him as being the better of the quarterbacks. I think a guy like Cam, and I compared this, not too long ago. I really sort of thought about this, but everybody remembers when a guy like Jaden Daniels came out, when a guy like, Michael Penix Jr. came out, and, a couple of guys from college that weren't always, Michael Penix wasn't a run-first guy, but we knew Jaden Daniels used his wheels to his advantage a whole bunch at LSU, but nobody ever had any definitive time on their 40-yard dash, and Cam Ward's the same way. We don't have any definitive time on his 40-yard dash, which I think is smart because I think he's going to shock a lot of people in the NFL with how actually athletically gifted he is. We saw that at Washington State so early on in his career. He didn't do it as much in Miami because he was playing in a much more of a pass-efficient offense. So we got to see how elite of a pocket presence quarterback he was and a guy at extending plays he was, and he was marvelous. I think Cam Ward's the number one overall pick in the draft. I think the Titans are going to grab a franchise quarterback. And I just ultimately, you could only hope it goes well for them because they've struggled so much at finding a guy. But they built the right team around him. Cam Ward is going to be, he's going to be a spectacle to watch about as much as Shedeur Sanders. So that is our top 10, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you approve of my top 10. And if you got any feedback, let me know in the comments section below. And as always, it is your host, Stephen Trader, signing out.